Hey, look out. It's Faith Talk Live. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
If you're watching Facebook Live or YouTube Live, there on the screen is Kimberly Dickson. She manages special projects for Christian nonprofit CBE International. Kimberly, how are you?
I'm doing great. So happy to be here.
Well, thank you for smiling. It looks like you're excited to be with us. Most people, though, start frowning, don't they, Dan? When
They do. They see us and they go, "Oh, you're not what we expected."
Not those guys. But hey, we want to thanks for hanging with us today. We want to learn more about CBE International, what you guys are doing. You focus on women in scripture and mission. Tell us first of all how you connected with CBE. How did this happen?
So yeah, I'm doing my apprenticeship with CBE International, and I'm a seminary student at Fuller Theological Seminary, and their president was one of my professors. She talked about women in the church, in history and theology, which I found fascinating. So I'm doing my apprenticeship with them, and we wanted to highlight women in scripture and mission for all the women who are driving their kids to school in the morning and evening, and when they're listening to the radios, and the men as well, because it's something that isn't talked about very much.
Mm-hmm. But talk about the importance that some of these women have played. I mean, you highlight folks like obviously Eve. You start off from the very beginning, but important. You highlight folks like Hagar, Esther, Elizabeth, Anna, Mary Magdalene, different folks like that. Talk about the significance these women have played in the Bible.
Yeah, it's been really fun to uncover a lot of these women's stories, and they are significant. I mean, if we start right away with Eve and the creation, God looked at Adam and he had just said, you need to govern this garden. This garden's going to sustain you. And then he went, this is not good for him to be alone. And so in the Genesis 2 account, he then creates the animals and parades them all in front of Adam, and he names them, but they can't find anyone that's good for Adam. And finally, it's like, you know what? We need someone made of the same sustenance, the same image of God as Adam. And when Eve was created, he did this celebration poetry, like, finally, someone of my own flesh. It's a beautiful poem. And Ezer was created. I mean, I use the word Ezer. That's the Hebrew word that's used for Eve. It's the same word that's used in Psalm 121 when it talks about God. When I look to the mountains, where does my help come from? My help, that's Ezer. My Ezer comes from the creator of the heavens and the earth. And that, we're made in God's image, and women as made in God's image, that's the word that was used for her. She's this help in the garden, in governing and sustaining, working alongside Adam. And so just as a foundation, it's just so beautiful. And then you see throughout scripture with these women that you just talked about or mentioned their names, all of these amazing things they do and different things they represent. I think of Sarah and Abraham and God choosing them for the covenant promise. And it's such a insight into God choosing us in the midst of who we are in our sin in the very beginning to redeem the world. And both of those characters are very complicated. They do things that we now can say, I don't think that's right. And actually even Mosaic law came along and said, yeah, no, that's not okay. And yet God decided to work amongst these flawed human beings, Sarah and Abraham, to bring a redemptive story. And we could just keep going through all of these women. Some of them have done amazing things. We all know the story of Esther, who basically was, in our words today, trafficked. She was chosen to be the king's wife with no choice of her own. And she used the position she was in to save her people. And her leadership compared to the king's leadership, starkly different. Hers is vast in prayer, and her people are behind her and are supporting her. And she goes forward with courage and selflessness instead of selfishness. And it's just amazing. So we wanted to bring these women who we don't get to hear a lot about out out into the public where people can hear their stories again and really think, wow. And we think it's a blessing for the whole church, for men and women together.
Definitely.
Kimberly Dickson with us. She's a part of CBE International, and we're talking about amazing women in scripture and mission. As these women have been just unpacked, I mean, we've all read the Bible, right? And we read the stories about the women, but which women to you, Kimberly, did they just come alive through this whole process?
You know, one of the women that really came alive for me was Hagar. And I think that's because, you know, when Muhammad came along in the 500s AD, they attributed Islam and the Muslim population to Ishmael, which is Hagar's son.
Mm-hmm.
But that was thousands of years after Hagar's story. But it has caused us to kind of skip over her story and not to really read it and to pay attention to it. So when I really read it and paid attention to it and started listening to other voices, I learned that she has been a very symbolic person for African American Christian women, because she's someone who was the slave of Sarah. So here are the covenant people, and she is a slave. And yet God frees later the Israelites from slavery. And here she is, their slave. And then she's abused by Sarah, and Abraham allows it to happen. And then she's thrown out finally with her son into the desert. And there, she's afraid, she's crying because she thinks he's going to die in the desert. And the power of the story is that God hears her cry, and he hears Ishmael's cry, and he answers her, and he sees her. And she actually, and I did not know this until I started really studying her story, she is the first person in scripture to name God. And she names him El Roi, the God who sees. And a lot of women who have been through abuse, this story really speaks to them, and it speaks to their story. And so to be able to unpack it and go, God sees women in abusive situations. God sees women in situations that we kind of want to ignore because the surface level is what we're looking at, but underneath some abuse is happening, and God goes in and he saves her life. He saves Ishmael's life. And then he gives her hope for a future. He says, I will make you into a great nation. And later in Genesis, they go through the line of Ishmael and the great nation he did become.
You gotta love all these women had, you know, such different encounters with God or with Jesus or with both, but their stories are just so compelling. And just, you know, even I love Sarah because she laughed at God. And how many times have I done that and said, you know, God, what, God, you want me to do what? Ha, that's crazy. And then of course he does it. But you gotta love that.
It's so true. And even that story, when you think about it, I mean, she's almost 100 years old and God says she's going to have a baby. I mean, who wouldn't laugh?
Yeah.
It's just so great.
That's a good one, God.
Yes.
I don't know that my wife would laugh. I think she would be upset, but yeah, I know what you're saying.
Cry, I think is what mine would do. Yeah.
Kimberly Dickson with CBE International. So Kimberly, what have you heard from ladies? I mean, you did share some with those that have been abused. I thought that was beautiful. I mean, my gracious. I mean, I've read about Hagar, known about, but when you start digging into that, and she cried out the first time someone said, God sees. What, I mean, how cool is that? Give us some other stories of ladies, maybe that girls, women that have listened and heard the stories and just been encouraged and empowered, if you will.
Well, I mean, our highlighting these women with you has only been 1 month long. So we're just barely starting to get out there and to hear impact. But I know that when women do hear about these women in scripture, it is transforming. They go, wait, what? I don't remember that story. We've heard a lot of stories about David and Goliath, as we should. Those are great stories. But like stories about Hagar, I mentioned it, but for the African American population, the thing they say is she was a woman who was abused by an abuser. And they're talking about Sarah and the fact that she was, in our modern language, pimped out by Abraham twice, according to scripture. And so she had her own trauma. And then rather than transforming that into something good, she abused someone else. And African American women have said that this speaks to their situation because they've been abused by white women who often are abused in their situation. So it's very powerful that way. But there are also other stories of women that make women go, oh, I can do that. And some of these stories, for example, when I started to understand who Phoebe was, it was a very powerful story. We read about her in Romans 16, and she was called a deacon. And she, based on what the scripture says about her, she was probably a very wealthy patron that helped support the church financially and was a leader within the church. And Paul chose her to take his most important letter that he wrote, which is the book of Romans, to Rome. Which to me, like, okay. So she was, maybe traveling there and brought a letter and handed it to the church. And then I started learning about what a letter carrier actually does. And a letter carrier is tutored by the writer to recite the letter to the listening audience. Yes. So she stood before the Church of Rome and recited Paul's letter, probably in his tone of voice and with his emphasis to the church so that they could experience what he was trying to say. And then she answered their questions. That just floored me when I understood that's what a letter carrier does. And I go, wow. So women in ministry, women who are teaching and preaching, this has been there all along.
Yeah.
We just didn't understand it.
Wow.
Love this. It's being uncovered, and you can go to radiowomen.org to find out more. In fact, you can, they've got a conference, which we'll talk about at a later time specifically, but there's an international conference coming up in August at the Weston Airport there in Atlanta. We'll discuss that next time. Kimberly, we appreciate you. This is awesome. I love this. You've thrown out some nuggets there. I'm going to think on and chew on and actually share with my wife here in a little while. So it's really, really cool. Kimberly Dickson, CBE International. Again, you can go to radiowomen.org to find out more. We got to take a break. We'll be right back. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
This is
Thanks for having me.